It's that time of year again, at least in some parts of the world. Candy canes, gingerbread, big trees.
Who's there? I have a gun!
Oh, yeah. Wrapping paper, debt, relatives, waiting for your car to heat up before going to your mindless dead-end job. 'Tis the season, and for someone like me, it's a rather mixed experience, as is the case with many people, not to mention how often this sentiment crops up in media. I know. Stop the presses. A millennial is feeling disillusioned by commercialized holidays? It's a pretty big cliche, I admit, but there are parts of the holidays that I do genuinely like. I do enjoy getting the right gifts for the right person, or at least hoping they're the right gifts and that the ones receiving them can feign excitement long enough for me to feel validated in spending so much money on them. I just wanted cash. But yes, cynicism of the season is about as much a tradition as Christmas trees and figgy pudding. And it's not like the commercialization machine itself hasn't gotten in on the action.
Let's just agree that the commercialization of Christmas is at best a mixed blessing.
However, there is a movie out there that I believe not only encompasses that feeling of ennui towards commercialized Christmas, but puts it in a very interesting and still relevant light. Something that's simultaneously scathing, hopeful, downright hilarious, and very, very hairy.
Kids today, so desensitized by movies and television.
I want to be clear that for the most part, I'm not trying to make objective arguments, whatever the heck that's supposed to mean, as to why I truly adore this movie. And yes, I adore this movie. I've got this, I've got this, I've got this, I've got 2 of these. This is actually pretty dang good. I went on eBay and paid actual money for this. There are plenty of people that hate it, and honestly, I can't really argue with some of the issues they have. But for the most part, this video is about why I like it, and not why everyone else is wrong for thinking otherwise. First, let's start with a bit of history. Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas was published in 1957 and became one of his most famous works. The story was adapted into a 26-minute short by Chuck Jones in 1966, and he showed up in 2 subsequent animated shorts, Halloween is Grinch Night and The Grinch is the Cat in the Hat. Does that count as an expanded universe?
How you doing, kitty kitty? Are you feeling pretty good, Mr. Cat in the Hoot?
Anyway, despite the many animated shorts, children's toys, and even video games that were licensed off of his work, Theodore Geisel always had strict control over his creations, and up until his death in 1991, no feature-length films had been made from his books. Not that he was necessarily against the idea, as he was working on a screen adaptation of Oh, the Places You'll Go right before he died, but it wasn't until his widow Audrey Geisel took charge of the brand that, for good or ill depending on your perspective, the gears started to turn on full-length Seuss adaptations. Okay, it did take a little bit of time for the gears to start moving, but in 1998, Audrey Geisel and her legal team drafted a letter outlining what they would require at the minimum in order to license a Grinch movie.
In order to pitch their ideas to Geisel, the suitors ultimately had to be willing to pay $5 million for the material and hand over 4% of the box office gross, 50% of the merchandising revenue and music-related material, and 70% of the income from book tie-ins. The letter also stated that any actor submitted for The Grinch must be of comparable stature to Jack Nicholson, Jim Carrey, Robin Williams, and Dustin Hoffman. Additionally, the estate would not consider any director or writer who hadn't earned at least $1 million on a previous picture.
Here are a list of directors that pitched ideas but did not get Audrey Geisel's approval. The Farrelly brothers, John Hughes, Tom Shadyac, who had 20th Century Fox backing him up, and they even had Jack Nicholson, who had expressed interest in the part. Universal's initial pitch with producer Brian Grazer and director Gary Ross. Eventually, Universal and Grazer got the contract, but only after they switched out Ross for Ron Howard, and only once they secured Jim Carrey to the part. She also reserved the right to object if she had any issues with the script, and she did exercise that right a few times during the production. This included a joke about a Jewish family that the Grinch referred to as the Hoosteins, and a stuffed cat in the hat hanging on the Grinch's wall. With all the particulars hashed out, production began in September of 1999, and the film was released in November of the following year. When critics got to see it, well, as I said earlier, reactions were mixed.
This is a movie that devotes enormous resources to the mistaken belief that children and their parents want to see this dank, eerie, weird movie about a sour creature who lives on top of a mountain of garbage, scares children, is mean to his dog, and steals everyone's Christmas presents. Yes, there's a happy ending, and even a saintly little girl who believes the Grinch may not be all bad. But there's not much happiness before the ending, and the little girl is more a plot device than a character.
and yet despite that, audiences seem to have eaten it up at the time as it grossed over $300 million at the box office. That said, the movie doesn't feel like something that really stuck with anyone who was an adult when they saw it, which kind of points to part of Ebert's point there, and yet I still think he underestimated what children wanted to see, as a majority of the enthusiasm for the film has been coming from those of us who were kids when we first saw it. So the question becomes, is this just another nostalgic piece that millennials overinflate the qualities of because we're seeing it through rose-tinted glasses? Well, obviously I'm here to argue that that's not the case, but let's see if we can really zero in on what makes this movie work despite its reputation. To put it simply, all the elements are not just oddly specific to my taste in comedy and filmmaking, but it all comes together in a way that gets me at an emotional level as well.
Oh no, the slave, the present, they'll be destroyed. And I care! What is the deal?
Ron Howard's direction is utterly bizarre here, and unlike anything I've ever seen from the guy. Then again, I think one of Ron Howard's strengths is how well he can simply adapt to the kind of film he's making and not necessarily leave a stamp on it, at least not in the same way how you always know when you're watching a Michael Bay movie, a Spike Lee movie, or even a Paul W.S. Anderson movie. He reminds me a lot of Joe Johnston in that way, where his filmography is an eclectic mix of tough projects that he managed to turn around into something great, or at least fairly good. Joe Johnston's The Wolfman, while not a masterpiece by any stretch, managed to turn such a mishandled production into something eminently watchable. And just recently, Ron Howard's Solo ended up being a really enjoyable entry in the Star Wars series, despite not only coming onto the project after Disney fired some very beloved filmmakers, but also at a time where Star Wars was experiencing a rather obnoxious bit of blowback from The Last Jedi. But then again, in that movie, he was clearly working off of something that pre-existed, both in terms of the character's history in the original trilogy and the aesthetics of the new films. Where in the heck was he drawing from to make this?
The audacity! The unmitigated gall!
Then again, I guess it is a bit inaccurate to give Howard all the credit here, as he himself in the audio commentary name-checks many of the artists and designers who made this movie look the way that it does.
Don Peterman was the cinematographer on this film. The executive producer on the film, Todd Hollowell, was also the second unit director. Alan Hall was our on-set physical effects supervisor, Meredith Boswell, who was a real inspiration on this movie. She was a set decorator. Rita Ryak and her costuming. She was nominated for an Academy Award. Gail Ryan and the challenge that she had as the hairdresser.
But it's such a weird and somewhat dark interpretation of Seuss's work, which I guess is what a lot of people took issue with, but frankly, it's so much more appealing to me than the soft edges we've seen added to Seuss's work since then. For the time, this was a ridiculously expensive movie to make, and it shows in every frame. All the sets, the props, even the characters themselves are artificial or have some degree of enhancement through special effects. It immerses you in this artificial world where all of civilization exists within a 1 square mile village, like visiting a theme park.
The Grinch stole Christmas. Then we brought it back.
Or perhaps more appropriately, a Christmas village. Something that wasn't organically built, but created just for the audience's amusement. It reminds me very much of Robert Altman's Popeye movie from 1980, which is another personal favorite of mine, and takes a similar approach to its set design. Popeye's Sweet Haven may be run down and authentic, while Whoville is slick and artificial, but both populate the worlds with such rich detail that you can have a great time simply by pointing out things in the background, or watching how the extras interact with each other. It breathes life into the overly fantastical settings of these films, which to me makes them much more real than plenty of other movies that have a much more grounded aesthetic. If the goal was to create a world that is simultaneously believably realized and artificially constructed, I think they succeeded with all the little spinning widgets, silly costumes, and very committed actors playing the Who's, creating an atmosphere of overwhelming whimsy, but also one ripe for a cynic to utterly detest and try to destroy. The Grinch as a character in this movie is one of the best translations of a fictional character into live action that I've ever seen. The costume itself, which was designed by legendary makeup artist Rick Baker, is quite spectacular throughout the whole movie, with only the occasional seam popping up here and there. Just looking at all the creases and the way it completely reshapes Jim Carrey's face while still being flexible enough to express a wide range of emotions is a testament to how phenomenal the finished product is. And this is all practical effects. No digital touch-ups anywhere, not even on the eyes, which were very uncomfortable contacts that Jim Carrey had to wear throughout the production. Speaking of whom, the guy throws himself into this role with gusto, making the most out of the material he's given.
How dare you enter the Grinch's lair!
It came without ribbons. It came without tags. It came without packages, boxes, or bags. Hold me down! I'm in it! I'll get over! I'll be held to pay! If you utter so much as one syllable, I'll hunt you down and gut you like a fish! If you'd like to fax me, press the star key.
The guy's chops as a physical comedian are on full display here, as he works with the costume to create some very memorable and hilarious moments. Just look at the way he uses his fingers throughout the movie. The guy is putting so much effort into his performance and not a single ounce of it is wasted. And it's not just limited to his comedic scenes either, though those do work incredibly well. Like the tone of the rest of the movie, his performance as the Grinch rides a very delicate line between something broad and fun on the surface, with a deeper pathos burning underneath it. Whether or not you like the plot of this movie, and we'll get to that soon enough, it's hard to argue that Jim Carrey isn't selling the pain. I mean, it's not Shakespeare, but for someone like me, I really do understand the Grinch's sadness and the defenses he's put up to protect himself from further pain. I write snarky reviews on the internet as a way of expressing myself, and the few times I've done videos in the past have been under a cartoon persona. Trying to put forth a fake version of yourself, one that's wittier, stronger, or even meaner than you really are, well, I'm sure a lot of us can relate.
Am I just eating because I'm bored?
Now, we don't really need a reason for the Grinch to be the Grinch, which is a common complaint many people have with this movie. You know, why take a very short story and stretch it out into a feature-length film? Especially when the animated special was able to compress it into 26 minutes. Well, let me tell you exactly why I think this story is actually pretty fantastic, even if it does embellish on the source material. One of the most underrated aspects of this movie is how tight the script is and how there really isn't any wasted elements in here. Aside from Stu and Drew, I guess. We start with two parallel stories. The Grinch up on Mount Crumpet, hating Christmas, the Who's, and everything they represent, and Cindy Lou Who being ambivalent about the overt commercialization of the season.
For the next 5 minutes only, 99% off!
The Grinch, through a lifetime of miserable experiences, has no love left in his heart for the Who's. Not that they were giving him a reason not to hate them in the first place, but we'll get to that soon enough. Put a pin in that. And he spends much of his time making their lives just a little bit worse, while Cindy is starting to grow out of that sense of childhood wonder and is starting to see things, as well as adults, in a less than idealistic light.
Well, it's just I look around at you and Mom and everyone getting all kabobbled. Doesn't it seem superfluous?
Both have clearly set up motivations for the actions that they take throughout the film, and after a chance encounter with the Grinch at the post office,
The Grinch!
their fates become inexorably intertwined. Cindy Lou Who becomes curious about the Grinch and why so many people are scared of him, and so she starts to ask some of the adults around town who knew the Grinch when he was younger, before he left the town to live on the mountain. It turns out that he was always a mischievous little brat, but the kids of Whoville only made things worse with regular teasing, particularly from this kid who is now the mayor of Whoville.
You don't have a chance with her. You're 8 years old and you have a beard.
However, there was one person in class who he liked, Martha May Whovier, and she seemed to like him back. So for once he opens himself up and does something truly sincere by making her a present. However, he's still insecure about himself due to the aforementioned teasing.
You're 8 years old and you have a beard.
And tries to shave, which goes horribly wrong, and he's hurt so badly by the reaction of everyone at the school that he lashes out,
The anger.
The fury.
The muscles.
and runs away to live on Mount Crumpet forever, hating the Who's,
I hate you!
and of course hating Christmas. The biggest representation of false sincerity and hypocrisy for the Who's, who couldn't extend that Christmas cheer and good tidings to him, despite how much they claim to treasure that. Instead, he more or less becomes a figure of myth for the Who's, some boogeyman to be feared instead of a person who they've wronged in the past.
They say he lives up here in a big cave, and he only comes down when he's hungry for the taste of who flesh.
Oh, Drew!
Cindy Lou Who, having heard enough and understanding what the Who's did to the Grinch, pleads with her fellow Whovillians to right the wrongs of the past and live up to the true nature of Christmas that she feels has been absent from their over-the-top consumerism. Or to put it another way,
I know you hate Christmas, but what if it's all just a misunderstanding?
Don't care.
I mean, I myself am having some Yuletide doubts. But maybe if you can reunite with the Who's and be a part of Christmas,
Maybe if you can reunite with the Who's and be a part of Christmas.
Grow up!
then maybe it'll be all right for me too.
I'm sorry, your session is over. Please make another appointment with the receptionist on the way out.
To wit, she successfully has him nominated as Holiday Cheermeister, some sort of ceremonial position that will hopefully convince him that the Who's are worth forgiving, as well as convince the Who's that he is not an outright monster. And the thing is, it works! He has a great time there, and the Who's seem to have gotten over the fears of him rather quickly. However, the mayor is none too pleased with any of this, and admittedly it is a bit naive to expect one good day to fix 30 years of bad blood, and finds a way to ruin everything.
Good time.
Why are you bringing up old The Grinch, being forced to remember his humiliation as a child, reverts back to cynic mode and tells the Who's off for their greedy and avaricious ways.
The avarice never ends!
None of what he's saying is necessarily false, but unlike Cindy Lou Who, whose apprehensions are born from a place of empathy, the Grinch is coming at them simply to lash out once again. And lash out he does. He causes the Who's to riot, burns down the big tree in the middle of town, and jets back to Mount Crumpet to bask in his victory. With the mayor presumably getting exactly what he wants, he publicly shames Cindy Lou Who for trying to bring the Grinch back into their lives.
I'm so disappointed.
And convinces everyone to go back to their blindfoldly cheerful and shallow interpretation of what Christmas is all about.
Can we just get back to Christmas the way it should be? Grinchless.
The Grinch, catching wind of this, decides that the only way these Who's will ever learn the lesson is if he takes away the one thing they care about most, Christmas itself. And so we get to the meat of the original story. The Grinch goes out on Christmas Eve and steals everyone's presents, decorations, and even the food.
Hark!
Afterwards, he heads back to Mount Crumpet to bask in his glory once again. Surely he's won this time, right? Well, at first that seems to be the case, as the Who's are genuinely distraught by the lack of stuff, since that's what they've always been told Christmas is about.
Invite the Grinch! Destroy Christmas!
However, it turns out that Cindy managed to reach at least one person who steps up to defend her once the mayor starts in on the accusations. Her father. Yes, her father stands out for her, and this act is so inspirational that the rest of the Who's learn their lesson as well. They don't just come out singing because they knew about the spirit of Christmas all along. There was an actual arc to all of this, and the moment is very much earned in this film. As in the original story, though with much more context and thematic resonance, the Grinch hears their singing and, well, he has a thought that he never thought before. Maybe Christmas really doesn't come from a store. Maybe Christmas
means a little bit more.
Maybe things aren't always as bad as they seem, or more importantly, maybe the failings of some are not the failures of all, and maybe there is a way to find happiness and fulfillment outside of just being cynically and stubbornly right about things. With a change of heart, so to speak, and one small action scene, the Grinch returns to Whoville, returns all the presents, and wins over not just the town, but his old friend Martha May as well. The Grinch carves the roast beast, cut to the final shot, and cue the Faith Hill song.
Where are you, Christmas?
I mean, look, it's not the most complicated or deep story about the spiritual emptiness of consumerism.
Brilliant! You reject your own nose because it represents the glitter of commercialism. Why didn't I think of that?
And watching a grumpy dude learn to care about others is, well, a tale as old as time. But it works here. The Grinch is compelling to watch on screen, and for me, I think he nails that kind of grouchy character who needs to learn a lesson by the end, and honestly, this particular version of that character is even more relevant today than ever. Throughout the movie, he is more or less right about the Who's and Christmas, and it's actually a lot more sinister in the book.
I pointed to a Who in the audience. That Who got his wife a friolator, while his secretary got a mink muzzle nuzzle. That Who's wife slapped him in the face. And his secretary is his wife's sister. And his wife is expecting. The crowd groaned.
But what does it matter when it's clearly not making him or anyone else happy? We see this kind of theme with characters like Dr. House and Rick Sanchez. But not only did this guy beat them to the party, I guess I like the expedience of this one, where you don't spend so much time with him that you start to lose perspective of why this character's wrong in the first place, which I think is a particular issue with Rick. This scene from the episode Vindicators 3 sums up Rick's character very succinctly.
The fact that I was right about them must be pretty hard to admit. Yeah, it is. You know why, Rick? Because when you're an it doesn't matter how right you are, nobody wants to give you the satisfaction.
But the show has to keep going after that, and so it never feels like this flaw is really addressed so much as the show learns to put up with it. The big Hollywood happy ending in The Grinch may be a bit over the top and idealistic, but it shows a bit more, I don't know, I guess you could say responsibility when it comes to portraying such cynical characters. Cynicism and irony are baked into the fabric of the internet as well as social media, and while I indulge in it just like everyone else, it becomes a drain on your soul, conscience, what have you, and it starts affecting everything everything else in your life. Rick has never had a legitimate point about anything, yet people hail him as some sort of idealistic figure of rationality, missing the point to be sure, but I don't see many people saying that the Grinch's arc was unnecessary, even if, once again, he is right about a lot of things.
I want a pony so I can ride it twice, get bored, and sell it to make glue!
This is why Cindy Lou Who is so important to the story and is one of the main reasons why so much of the movie works. Speaking of Cindy Lou Who, I wonder what she's up to nowadays. Huh, cool. Anyway, this character has a rather thankless task here since she's the straight person to Jim Carrey's absurd and eccentric performance, and on top of that, she's driving the plot more than anyone else here. She has to become motivated to learn more about the Grinch, which gives us the backstory of his character without him ever actually having to do anything. She drags the Grinch into the story by nominating him as Cheermeister, and if that wasn't enough, she has to be the philosophical counterbalance to the Grinch's cynical view of Christmas, without falling into the easy trap of extolling the virtues of the holiday unexamined. Not an easy task for a 7-year-old actor, yet Taylor Momsen pulls it off with an earnest performance backed up by a script that covers a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time, while also never letting up on the humor. The framing device for the backstory is kind of brilliant in that it allows us to not only get a handle on the history, but on characters who are relevant to the story right now, like Mayor Mayhew, Martha May Whovier, and even Cindy Lou Who has to convey how much she's learned and the conflict it creates within her. Compare that to the new movie, where everything just feels contrived with so much pointless filler. Subplots are introduced and not followed up on. Cindy Lou Who and the Grinch meet, yet nothing comes about because of it. Everything plot related happens independent of this interaction. Now sure, I'm probably overthinking all this to a certain extent, and I don't want to come off as throwing meaningless buzzwords at you to try and justify a movie I like, but when I really start to look at this movie piece by piece, I just have a hard time understanding why some people are so dismissive of it. Not that I find it impossible to find faults with this though, and sadly we do need to get to that as well. This is not a perfect movie. I'm pretty sure there's no such thing as one, except for maybe Dr. Strangelove, but regardless, there are still a few flaws worth mentioning here. Despite how much I find this movie utterly hilarious, not every joke lands.
Now pucker up and kiss it, Who Bill! Taxi! It's because I'm green, isn't it?
Kiss me, you fool.
I think the third act where they recreate the original story is fine, and there are some great physical gags there, but it feels a bit less inspired than everything else. Not to mention that having Cindy Lou Who not recognize the Grinch in this scene, despite having interacted with him so many times before, feels a bit forced. Then again, we do get this rather great line, so it kind of evens out for me.
Nice kid. Bad judge of character.
This is the only area where I feel the new Grinch is the superior film, as the animation is really on point here and doesn't feel quite as perfunctory as it does in the Ron Howard movie. I really do like Martha May's character in this, but she isn't really treated all that well here, and some of the Grinch's more cringe-worthy moments involve the way he acts around her. Clint Howard's character, whose name is Hubris, is pretty fun in the movie, though they do err a bit too closely towards making him a foppish gay stereotype, especially in the novelization where the implications of the movie become unnecessarily explicit.
"Merry Christmas," the mayor said cheerily as he stormed out again. Hubris followed him at a discreet distance. "You know, this is sort of my deal," Mayhew whispered furiously, kicking Hubris in the kneecap.
I won't be a third wheel,"
Hubris protested, rubbing his knee.
"Merry Christmas, Mayor Mayhew,"
sniffled Hubris.
"I have nothing to give you except my eternal love."
"What?" shouted Mayhew. I mean, respect. Merry Christmas, sir."
I mean, sure, I'm probably one of maybe 100 or so people who've actually read this thing, but reading the book puts the somewhat tone-oblivious nature of his character into sharp relief. And not everyone is going to need to read a book to have it made that clear for them. I'm sure there's a huge discussion to be had about the connection between lickspittle stereotypes and how often they transition into gay stereotypes. Ahem. But in any case, it's something that's unavoidably there.
A handsome, noble man. A man who's had his tonsils removed twice!
Also, this guy being in it. And let's be real here, people. This guy too. Wow. What might be the biggest mark against this film, though, is something that's not necessarily on camera, but something that has come to light fairly recently. At least specific to this film, and not about the recent allegations against Jim Carrey. Again, wow. Jim Carrey was pretty miserable in the makeup, as it took many hours just to get it on, and even when it was on, it wasn't a comfortable suit to wear.
Jim Carrey was absolutely miserable every moment that he had to be in the Grinch costume. And yet he loved what Rick Baker had designed and loved being the Grinch. But everything about it was literally painful for Jim. The contact lenses that he had to wear, the bodysuit, the hours and hours it took to put on the makeup.
His frustrations bled out onto the rest of the production, and he was especially nasty towards one of the makeup artists, Kazuhiro Tsuji, who had to leave the production partway through because of how nasty Jim Carrey would get while trying to apply the makeup.
In the makeup trailer, he just suddenly stands up and looks in the mirror, and pointing on his chin, he goes, "This color is different from what you did yesterday," Tsuji remembered. "I was using the same color I used yesterday." He says, "Fix it." And okay, I fixed it. Every day was like that.
Kazuhiro Tsuji was brought back after Rick Baker and Ron Howard gave Jim Carrey a talking to about his attitude, and from what I can tell, Jim Carrey did take the lesson to heart, and after Ron Howard convinced Tsuji to come back, he did keep his temper in check for the rest of the production. Now, some of this can be attributed to Jim Carrey's personality, as he does have a reputation for being difficult to work with.
You got me a drink?
No, go away.
What?
Go away.
Wait!
I don't want to go away.
But even more so than that, I think this is something worth keeping in mind when we praise practical or photorealistic effects and denigrate films that can't measure up to those. There are plenty of stories of visual effects and makeup artists pushing themselves way too hard making the special effects that we love to see in movies. Rob Bottin, the visual effects mastermind behind The Thing, which is still one of the most impressive movies of all time, was hospitalized for exhaustion during the movie's production. And even with modern day changes like CG animation and a lot more work that can be done in post-production, the visual effects business is still struggling with long and intense production schedules, diminishing returns for the work they do, and a market that is almost too big to be sustainable. No one who works as hard as Kazuhiro Tsuji should have to go home at the end of the day feeling overly stressed by the work that they do for us. And there are too many people out there in the industry who are in the same boat, yet haven't had a chance for their story to be heard. I love the costumes and the makeup in this movie, which do a phenomenal job of placing us in this wacky and charming world, but there had to have been a better way to handle the stress that everyone was feeling so that this didn't end up happening to one of the people responsible for this amazing work. It's not always fun to look behind the curtain and see how something you enjoy is made. Sometimes there's pain and suffering that should have been avoided and issues that should have been addressed before they blew up in everyone's face. Sometimes just through the passage of time, things change in ways that negatively color how we view a movie. However, I think it's necessary to confront these issues and at least have a conversation about them. There's no point in ignoring this kind of stuff when it comes up, and being able to face it and come to terms with it in some way is much better than trying to pretend it didn't happen. This stuff did happen, and this stuff continues to happen, and one of the ways we're going to fix it is by acknowledging that these issues are real, even if they happen in movies we love. I still love this movie. It's one of my favorites of all time, but that's not going to be the case for everyone, and for some of the reasons I've already mentioned. That's fine. I don't want to tell people that they're wrong for disliking this movie. At most, what I want is for people who maybe haven't seen it or haven't seen it in a long time to perhaps give it another chance. Even if we still can't agree on it, I'd be happy if we accomplished that much. So enjoy your holiday season as best you can, have some Who Beast or Who Beast substitute if that's your thing, and try not to let everything get to you. I know it's been hard with the way things have been going and how the holiday season can just compound those problems, but despite how all-encompassing the season can feel sometimes, it really isn't, and January's right around the corner. Have fun, be merry, and, I don't know, press the like button, I guess.
Oh, that's a good one. That is rich.
Let's go home.